call the meeting to order. Do a roll call.
Please use your mic.
Oh, yes.
Sorry.
And just so you all know, I'm going to do this temporarily through the end of this meeting, and then hopefully we have a full-time person, and we'll go from there. Leslie?
Here.
Niall?
He's absent. He'll be absent.
Myself, present. Mitchell?
Present.
Thank you. David? Here. Marion?
Here.
And Rick is not here. Okay. Want to have a motion to approve the agenda, but before we do that, I'd like to reorder the agenda, move back item 3 in case like a ranking comes. Right. Oh, okay, we won't have to do that. Great. A motion to approve the agenda.
Motion to approve the agenda.
A second.
Second.
Anyone opposed? Okay. I'm going to have Kelly lead item 3 and go from there.
So thank you. First, you'll notice I'm not Elena. She had a conflict this evening and she won't be here. So as just a reminder, I'm Kelly Stackowitz. I'm the Assistant City Manager. And then, Lewis Clark-Wardle, who's our budget analyst. So we will be your fearless staff for this evening. Item 3 is the appointment of the chair and vice chair. That would go through the remainder of our fiscal year, so anticipated to go through June of 2025. I just wanted to give a little bit of background for those of you who are new to our commission structure, what the chair and the vice chair do and what they don't do, and just talk to you a little bit about that and the process that we'll use to select the chair and vice chair. So the chair, as the most important thing that the chair does, is presides over the meeting. If the chair is unable to preside over the meeting for whatever reason, that is why we have a vice chair, and that person can step in the chair's absence or inability to chair a meeting. The chair and the vice chair will also work with staff in trying to put together or putting together the agenda. By putting together the agenda, I don't mean that the chair and the vice chair get to dictate what goes on the agenda, but actually it's more structuring the agenda so that the chair feels it's a manageable agenda, and so helping to order and figure out the times and maybe what item goes on which agenda, so that you don't end up with one meeting that's stacked with lots and lots of items that's impossible to get through. In order to be the chair or vice chair, you have to be a member of the commission. That's the qualification. So there's no requirement that you have been a commissioner for X amount of time. There's nothing specific that you have to know. We will be happy to work with you as the chair and the vice chair to help you learn what you need to do in order to run a meeting. And then as you are a chair, or as you're chairing a meeting, staff will work with you to try to figure out exactly how much or how little sort of staff assistance you might want. I've worked with chairs who would like lots of on-site hand-holding, which is absolutely fine. And I've worked with chairs who are like, I got this, stop talking, we're fine, and everything in between. So I just wanted to emphasize that if anyone is interested in chair or vice chair, you are qualified. That also goes for people who aren't here. So if anybody wants to nominate somebody who's not missing or who's not here tonight, you need not be present to win. That's fine. In terms of how we actually go about nominating, so you can nominate yourself, you can nominate one of your colleagues. It's a fairly casual process. There are no debates or speeches required, so we'll just put the names out there, and then interim chair Gellen can vote on, with whomever you have, kind of see how that plays out. If you have any questions, let me know right now, and we can just see how it goes. Does that make sense? Oh, I should note too that as Interim Chair Gillum said a minute ago, he'll chair the rest of this meeting, and then we'll start with the new chair and vice chair for the November meeting. So nobody's going to be put on the spot in 2 minutes.
Any process questions? Concerns? Okay, let's open the floor up.
I have a comment, suggestions here. So I mentioned this last time. I think it's important that for the chair to describe how they wish to conduct a meeting, if possible. If you haven't conducted one before, then not as easy. But from my standpoint, this is an advisory commission. I'm talking now about the rules of order that you would follow during the meeting. So in that it's advisory, I prefer an informal process whenever possible, which means that allows for more discussion, debate, engagement with the commission itself. It doesn't mean, though, that we wouldn't go through the order of having staff presentations and public comments that would start it. But then once we would going, I don't feel like we have to follow the rules of order, except in situations where it's apparent that we have something controversial on the agenda and it doesn't look like it's flowing very well if we're doing informal discussions. In that situation, I favor the chair exercising their authority or the commission voting on it, that we go into a more formal process. We make a motion, a second, somebody can make another second motion, and it's managed that way. My expectation is that wouldn't happen very often, but it could, and if it did, I'm okay with it, right? So I think those are good processes. The other comments that I have for the chair, my wish list for the chair is this. This is one of my pet peeves about some of the commissions and the public comments. My belief is that when we have the public there, after the staff presents, I would like to hear the public comments if possible, rather than waiting for a long conversation by the commission and engagement. The reason I prefer that, unless it's somehow prohibited by any rules that I'm not aware of, is I'm sensitive to public's time, and I don't want them to have to sit and wait for us if that's not necessary. So that'd be my favorite, but that'd be a chair call when you engage the public. My other bias for the chair is I believe the chair should focus on organizing the meeting as efficiently, as effectively as possible, and should not, that means that to a certain extent they have to keep their views and their desires a little bit closer to the vest, which means that usually I like to have the chair speak last rather than opening with their thoughts and trying to guide the discussion that way. So those are my thoughts. I'm happy to support anybody on this commission who wishes to volunteer and be chair and vice chair. I'm impressed with your credentials and character. I'm happy to nominate you, Steve, as chair or vice chair if you're interested, because I know you've been doing a good job the last couple of meetings. So, but I'll leave that up to you whether you wish a nomination, but I'd be happy to nominate you.
Any other nominations, suggestions?
Yeah, I have I've been thinking, I'm Leslie, I'm fairly new to this whole commission process. My first commission meeting was this past August, so I don't have a ton of experience on how, the role usually works. But from all I've learned, in looking at the role of the chair and the role of the commission, I thought it would be valuable to have someone who has some familiarity with the role and also has a fresh perspective, since the fiscal commission is new and it's merged from the two different commissions. And I thought if she's interested, I thought Commissioner Beitler would be great in the role of chair, so I wanted to nominate her. And while I'm at it, I would be interested in the role of vice chair, if that was
getting this done in a way that we can create a vote at some point. I don't want to close it off. Any other thoughts?
I like those nominations. Sounds good to me. And I feel similarly. I would be, if we're short of people to be vice chair, I'd be happy to, but we're not. So I don't need to, but I think that as a new person, I wouldn't want to be chair until I watch that.
I've heard your name. Any thoughts about it?
If everybody can use their mics, it would be great. Thank you.
Way over here.
No, I would be very interested and I would nominate myself for chair if this is a topic all the topics that the commission covers are ones that I'm very interested in, and I have, a lot of familiarity running meetings. Robert's rules are quite familiar to me, and so I would be very interested in working to set the agenda as well. So that's all I have to add.
Are we at a place where we're comfortable voting at this point then?
Somebody make a motion, I'm not clear where we are, so I'm happy to.
Well, I've heard two names phrased, Ranka as chairman. You raised my name. I'd be very comfortable being vice chairman, if that's what makes everybody comfortable.
I'll make a motion. I move that we make Rika chair for this fiscal year. So I guess it runs till the end of this fiscal year, and Steve as the vice chair.
Second. Any objections to that? I think we got a new chairman.
Before you complete the motion, I just want to take public comment just in case there is any.
Okay, fair enough. Is there any public comment?
Thanks for
No,
checking.
Okay. Okay, then we can move on. Congratulations.
You do.
Any brief announcements from staff?
I do not have any announcements.
From any of the commissioners, have any brief announcements? Anything from council?
No, thank you. I'm just really looking forward to Mr. Coleman's presentation, and congratulations to the new chair and vice chair.
And once again, let's check on, at this point, is there any public comment on any topic?
Good evening, everybody. My name is Howard Jackson. I'm on the school board, but I'm actually here in my capacity as a member of the Yes on Measure T campaign team. And Measure T is a measure that's on the ballot to raise basically a parcel tax amount by $49 in order to finance the operations of a second library in South Davis in Walnut Park next to Montgomery. The funds to actually build the new library are already there, and construction is set to start, I believe, roughly the middle of next year, and will be opening in roughly 2026. So Measure T would allow for the actual financing. If Measure T doesn't pass, what is likely to happen is that the funds that are available that are dedicated pretty much solely to the main library would be spread out a little bit so that the South Davis branch could have a day or two, and then there'd be a corresponding reduction in services probably at the Mary Stevens branch. What Measure T allows is for both branches to be fully operational. It optimizes the facilities for the community, and so especially for in South Davis, there's very little in the way of public meeting space. And just a reminder, some of the things that we benefit from the library in addition to meeting space, There are obviously the books that are available, both in traditional physical form as well as e-copies. There are periodicals and subscriptions that are also available, as well as a place to go if your internet goes out. You can use the Wi-Fi there. They have computers that are available. And of course, on a hot day in the summer, then it's a kind of a nice place to go to if your air conditioner breaks, as has happened with me in my time in Davis. I'm here because you all are engaged members of the community, and so I hope that you'll consider supporting. It requires 2/3 vote to pass. This looks like an extremely popular measure, and you see signs everywhere, but it, 65% will not cut it. It has to be 66 and a little bit more to pass safely. And, finally, I think that there are probably, if we do succeed in getting the 2/3 for this to pass, and I think there'll probably be some up-ballot measures that can ride our coattails in the November election. So thank you very much for your time. I'll leave a few flyers here if you'd like to read up on it. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Any written public comments? Okay, let's move on to item 6.
So item 6 is just the consent calendar.
Oh, I'm
the
sorry,
approval of
I'm
minutes.
sorry, I messed up. This is why we needed a chairman. Great, so we have, the only thing on the consent calendar is the approval of the minutes from our August and September meetings. Anybody have any issues with the minutes as they've been documented?
I have a comment, and I'll vote on the consent item, but this is a question for commission and staff, and how much detail should be in these minutes, and it's always a vexing issue, because if you make comments and they're not recorded, then they become ephemeral. They're lost in the wind. But if you write down in the minutes every comment, then it becomes not very helpful. So it's a strategy, I get that. But I didn't find these minutes helpful, other than it just gave a general overview of kind of what our votes were and what we approved. And for some items, I think that's fine. It's not that big a deal. But there was some stuff that I thought was more significant, where we could have made a difference and had some voices, and those comments could have been recorded. And then these minutes go on to the city council, so they're not lost in the wind. And they go on the public record. So I'm specifically talking about the item on, I believe it was the September 4th meeting that was presented by staff on how to put items on commission agendas. And the flow chart that was there. I and others on this, I spent a lot of time making comments. None of those were recorded. So, and that's, as I said, I'm not viewing that as a mistake necessarily, but I would like to get some rules out there that if we make comments, how are those going to be recorded? Do we have any obligation to provide written comments if that's what staff would like to assure? Because what I see is that item looked like it was not well debated, and I think it was. So anyway, and of the items, I think that was the most important. So that's my comment, and I'd be interested what others think on the commission.
Oh, I think you're right. I think it's a balance. I think it depends on what type of issue it was. That was informational. We didn't make an action. Doesn't mean that it shouldn't be documented, but I do think it has some bearing. I don't know. Do we have examples from other commissions?
Let me put on the table another route too. It could be the responsibility of the chair and the vice chair to make sure that the minutes accurately reflect some comments, or could go on to how you want the commissioners to provide input when those minutes are being drafted. Yeah, I agree, it was informational, but this was informational that was being passed on to the council for a highly, I believe, controversial item. I mean, we've been talking about, this is why this commission is in existence, because of a reorganization of the commission. So that's my 2 cents, and we'll be eager to hear how this gets resolved.
Can I ask who is in charge of making the minutes? Or who writes them?
If I can wait. So staff puts together the minutes. We are supposed to do basically modified action minutes. So not pure action minutes, which would only be your motions, and that's it. But motions along with a little bit of, I'll say, meat around the bones. So as Commissioner Sandino said, a little bit of dialogue. They're not verbatim minutes. We don't say, it's not a transcript. Message received that you'd like some more detail perhaps in the minutes, and we can look at those and work on that. I will say that for that particular item, there was, I took notes as well, much more detailed notes to share with the subcommittee, and that was the information going back to the subcommittee. So, and we did that for all the commissions. So they will get more of a flavor, and I honestly can't remember for this group whether or not one of the subcommittee members was here. We've been to 10 commissions in the past month, so they will get a richer flavor of all of the discussion that each commission had, whether or not they were there. If that's any help, Commissioner Sandino, for that particular item. So.
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, I made my comment. I know this is the first couple meetings, so there is an art to it. So I will plant the seed, though. I do think, am I right on this? The minutes would go to the council as, so they get to see these. So that's what I'm sharing with the other commissioners. And if they're not on the record, you can see we don't have a full house here. So they become useful for us, but I think the goal of the commission beyond that is to try to make a difference and share our wisdom, if that's the right word, with the actual decision makers. So
this is on the consent item every month. Was today in creating this, and we can use this item as a way to provide feedback to staff. Are we reaching the balance that you're talking about between efficiency and
yeah, absolutely, and it's quite possible that an individual member could, including myself, could try to take it off the consent and then try to substitute a different set of minutes. So.
Yeah, and I think maybe to the extent we can get the minutes in a timely manner, not that they aren't timely, you would have time, we would all have time to sort of really spend looking at them, making sure they reflect what we want them to reflect, consistent with sort of not creating a transcript.
So at this time, if we get the minutes, we can write to staff, like if we have a comment about things we would like to be addressed.
Well, we can, correct me if I'm wrong, we can not approve this item and provide feedback as to what it would take for us to approve it, or we can approve this, but each month sort of provide feedback on the subsequent 7 minutes to make sure they're reflective of the meeting. If that makes sense.
Yeah, perfect.
So I'm going to ask, are we comfortable enough with these to vote on this consent item and move forward? David?
Yeah, I said I would vote for it. I heard staff's point on the item that I had concern about, that they took notes and moved on. So I'm accepting that. This is just more pointing out for the future, I think, how I feel about the minutes. I do want more detail, I think, and there's a judgment call, but we can talk about it when it comes up.
Appreciate that. Then can I get a motion to approve the consent?
Can I ask you to ask for public comment first? Sorry.
Okay. Is there any public comment? Can I get a motion to accept the consent item? In a second?
Second.
Anyone opposed? Great. Thank you. Now we can move on to item 7.
So I'm very pleased this evening, just going to jump right into it, to be able to introduce Michael Coleman, sitting to my right, your left, who is one of the state's preeminent scholars and knowledgeable people on municipal finance, which in California is its own special treat. Michael has created a website that California City Finance, that's right, that has been used for years and is a treasure trove of information about all things local government finance. He has been the financial advisor for the League of California Cities and other entities too, I think. He also happens to be a Davis resident, so we're thrilled tonight to be able to pick his brain and learn from him. The last meeting, we talked a lot about utilities. This is really turning to the city finances specifically, and I think that you could probably pepper Michael with any question related to local government finance in California, and he can answer it. So I challenge you, as he's talking, to think about questions that you have. We really want to take this time to learn from him and think about questions that you might have or that you think that the rest of the group might be interested in, and ask those questions. So with that, I think I will turn it over to Michael and we'll get to it. You do have copies of the presentation that he's going to be providing at your seats. For those who are in the audience, there are copies as well at the back of the room if anybody wants to grab those. It will also be on the screens and the monitors. So with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you, and I hope we can kind of make this classroom environment kind of interchange, so feel free to jump in if you have questions, you want to engage in some particular question, or if I run through some acronym, as we all have acronyms, that can be a little bewildering at times. So there's so much to talk about in this, and if you've looked at the website, CaliforniaCityFinance.com, you'll see it's voluminous. It's an almanac. We call it the California Local Government Finance Almanac. There's a lot of databases and a lot of topics to discuss. Tonight, I thought we would begin with sort of an overview of the basic structure of local government finance and how it relates to how we deal with finances in local governments, in California in particular, which is different than businesses do, different than the state does, different than the schools do. As Clay says, it's its own special treat. So we'll get into some of the overview kinds of things, and then we'll have the opportunity to kind of delve into some particular topics that you may have of interest, or also may pique your interest with some ideas that we want to talk about at future times together. The first thing I always start off with is to point out that while we need to start someplace and talk about how things are structured for cities and for local governments in California, there's lots of variation. There's lots of variety. So quite obviously, the city of Davis is not the city of San Mateo. And its geography makes things very different about what kinds of city operations may need to be or desire to be provided. These things are reflected in finance as well, both on the revenue side and on the spending side. And Davis has its own unique special treat as well. There's a different community vision in many communities. We're a college town. That really dramatically affects the kinds of priorities in our community and the sensibilities. And of course, Davis is very well known for placing a much higher priority premium effort into parks and into recreation, to libraries, into education, into bicycles in particular, than others. And so that's very much reflected as well in the city's finances and in the character of the community. We're a smaller, we're a medium-sized city. There's a lot of variation in size, of course. There's urban, there's rural, there's different kinds of needs in terms of expenditures that come with that. But one of the things that people often miss when they look at how cities are different is that not only do we have different sort of visions and different sort of ideas, and these sort of, by the way, come about sort of by the nature of why a community chose to become a city. Communities incorporate to become cities because they want to have local control over, because they see themselves as having a unique character from other communities. And they want to have more control over the kinds of services that are provided, or the kind of land use that's developed and how that's done. Land use is often a big one too, and that too is related to finances as well. It's a whole other topic we can get into. But one of the things that's often missed is that there are full-service cities that are responsible for the full, call it, palette of municipal services that can be provided, and there are cities that are not full service, that are they don't provide the full level. And by that I don't mean the choice to contract out, let's say, fire services to someone else to provide fire services within a community. A city that does that is still responsible financially for that decision. You still see the revenues coming in for that service and the expenditures going out for fire services. Whether it's an in-house service or whether it's contracted, you still see the finances. So I'm not really talking about the decision about how services are provided, but whether the city is responsible for those financially at all. So if you go over to the city of Elk Grove, for example, or Rancho Cordova, they don't provide fire services. They're not responsible for fire services in their budget. And so you will see less revenue because there's a hunk of property tax revenue that the city would otherwise get that's instead going to the Sac Metro Fire Department, Fire District. And likewise, of course, you will see the expenditures for that function as well. So you have to kind of take that into account if we're going to compare two different cities. A couple of weeks ago, in a conversation about a local tax measure, a member of our community was saying, well, you know, look at San Ramon, they're doing things so much more efficiently. They have so much fewer staff and spending less, but San Ramon doesn't have a fire department. That's huge. It's a big difference. Davis doesn't have a library system. It's not a part of the city's budget either. We do have a library system, but it's the county library system. It's a separate special district. So there's one small example. Library has much smaller effect on things. It's 2 cents out of 2% out of the property tax base so it doesn't make comparatively as much difference as fire, which can be 18 cents on the dollar when it comes to property taxes, what fire districts often get. So that's an important distinction. Bottom line in all of this is that we have to start somewhere kind of making generalizations, but these generalizations, when it comes to comparing and kind of thinking about how we stack up to other communities, always have to be qualified with looking at why, peeling back the onion, what makes these things different. Because there are different priorities that kind of help to explain those differences. It doesn't necessarily usually doesn't draw easily to the conclusion that there must be waste and fraud going on in a community just because there's more money spent on one function or the other. Also, communities choose to do things differently in different ways, and that can make a difference. The other factor of this, of course, is that we're looking at the statewide level. We're looking at policy changes, like is there a better way to allocate sales tax revenue among cities? We necessarily have to think about who's affected and how in that. Communities are affected differently by those kinds of decisions, and that makes policy making that much more challenging. So I want to first start off with sort of an academic view about how to think about government revenues. When I was in biology class in high school, we all took biology class, and there was that section in biology where we talked about taxonomy, which had nothing to do with taxes per se, but was about how do we kind of think about the animal kingdom, and how do we sort of break it up into categories that may be related to evolution and how these different things evolve, but which things have 3 legs, which things have exoskeletons, and kind of break these into, remember there's that mnemonic we learned, King Philip, something or other, kingdom, phylum, genus, species. Well, this is sort of analogy here, the taxonomy of taxes, if you will, or taxonomy of government revenues. And the first thing that we might think about that distinguishes some kind of government revenues from others is who pays. And I'm not talking here about the sort of economic, the way economists think about it in terms of the incidence of who ultimately ends up paying for the tax, the burden, can it be passed on, and that kind of stuff. It's actually simpler than that. It's what does the law say, who is legally responsible to pay this? So a hotel tax, actually, as we administer it among local governments in California, it's often called the transient occupancy tax. I favor something like lodging occupancy tax is probably a more accurate term, because it's not just hotels and it's not transients as we think about it per se, but it is short-term stays in hotels and other overnight lodgings. So who is responsible for that? Well, while hotels are responsible for collecting it, the tax is legally actually on the occupant, and it shows up on your bill. You've probably seen that when you stay at hotels. So that's important. Even though you might charge the same rate to the hotel on the same basis, who is legally responsible becomes really important when society and technology and things change, and suddenly who's responsible now that we're collecting these things differently, like an online sale or something. Who's ultimately responsible for that tax, or how is it levied? The second kind of thing we might think about is what is the rate and what is the base of the tax? So is this a tax that is charged on a per unit basis? Is it charged based on the value of something? If it's charged on the value of something, how do we determine that value? It's not necessarily that simple. On a sales tax, that's pretty straightforward. What is the sales price of the item? But on a property tax, well, actually, it's not necessarily the market value of the property. Prop 13 gives us a whole, implemented by state law, a whole set of rules about how we determine the value of property for the purpose of property taxation. It's not market value. Your tax, your what we call the vehicle license fee, which is really a vehicle registration tax, no matter what they call it. It's a tax on your motor vehicles, and it's based on the value of your motor vehicle, but it's not, again, the sales price, because that would be too onerous administratively to go out and figure out what everybody's actual value of the vehicles is. So it's your purchase price of your vehicle, and then there's a depreciation schedule built into the state law that just sort of makes for the purpose of taxation, the value that you're taxed on goes down a bit every year. So there's lots of ways to do that. The value, the percentage of rate, a flat tax, and those all have implications for how the tax revenues grow over time, and how they behave, and how the widgets that you're measuring behave as well. So one of the obvious implications of that, and we can get into this further, is how we tax gasoline. This is not the sales tax on gasoline, but gas tax that you've heard about is a per gallon gas tax. There's a federal per gallon gas tax, and there's a statewide per gallon gas tax. And it has been for decades, the federal tax still is, static per gallon. This federal tax is 18.4 cents per gallon. It's been that way for decades. It doesn't change. So what happens if the same amount of gallonage is flat or slightly declining over time? The amount of revenue stays the same, and if you adjust for inflation, the purchasing power of that is going down. There's no natural inflation escalator. As opposed to a percentage tax on sales tax, on taxable sales, well, your revenue is going to naturally increase as the prices of things go up. So there's a built-in durability with inflation over time, which does occur, right? But we have fallen behind in terms of tax revenues for streets and roads, or gas taxes, because of that fixed price for gasoline. Now, we did fix that with SB 1 in 2017, which now has an annual cost of living adjustment to the state per gallon excise tax, and so that helps with that. But there's other issues with gas tax and how we finance roads that we can get into later. Anyway, so some issues there. Then who collects and who enforces the payment? This is really kind of important, right? You hope that whoever is collecting and enforcing the payment, who's responsible for that, is getting a piece of it as well, because you want some self-interest in that. It's a good thing that counties get some of the property tax, a substantial amount of property tax, because it's entirely a county function to assess, collect, and distribute property taxes and do it well. And that's in their own self-interest to do it well. So same with sales tax. The state gets a big part of the sales tax. It's a state agency that is responsible for collecting that and doing a good job of it. And it's in their own self-interest to do a good job of it. How is it allocated? Is this a tax that there's an allocation system that's built into the state law about who's going to get what? Is it something that's locally adopted, like our local lodging occupancy tax or business license taxes here in Davis that just goes into the general fund and we decide what to do with it, but it's a local tax that goes locally and we're not sharing it with other communities. There's different kinds of allocations. And then finally, what is it used for? Many of these taxes are earmarked for specific purposes, and we're going to get into this further, and that's in law. So if someone says, I think you should appropriate more money in the budget for the fire services because they really need to add another firefighter at this station or put more people on this particular truck, and there's plenty of money sitting over there in the water fund, you cannot do that. Those monies in the water fund were paid for water services, and that's because of the particular kind of revenue that goes into that fund. The general fund, we'll talk about more what goes into the general fund, has monies in it, revenues and tax revenues that are general purpose. They're not earmarked for specific purposes, and so that's a good thing. Cities that, I can tell you right now, again, it's another topic we'll get into further, but why cities go bad and get in financial trouble, one of the factors is, among many, is too many rules, too much fragmentation of rules about, special revenue. You can have some special revenue funds, but cities that tie themselves up in knots because they have gone for a 2/3 vote special tax on a sales tax, for example, instead of a general purpose tax, that contributes to financial instability and challenges in governing the budget financially. Because it doesn't give you the choice to decide in the future if the fire department's really struggling here, but the police department is flush with money in our budget, but you can't move it because you've earmarked revenues in some way. So anyway, got off on a tangent there, but general purpose tax revenues, I'm a big fan of. And I've seen evidence of why that's important in looking at why cities have gotten into trouble financially. The rules for all of this is in the law. I often tell folks if you're going into public policy, you should take at least one economics class. You should take at least one law class. Any kind of law, but get a sense of how the law is structured. Because public policy, including public finance, is very much based on what the rules are. And there's this hierarchy of laws that's built in. Of course, state statutes must comply within what the Constitution is. Our local ordinance has to comply with the above. And of course, the courts weigh in on how to interpret these various things very importantly. So let's talk about taxes. The notion of what is a tax, of course, is something worldwide and ancient. Taxation, coming up with monies to fund government structures and community structures is nothing new. In California, there's a specific definition of a tax, though. A tax is a charge which pays for public services or facilities that provide general benefits. There doesn't need to be a direct relationship between what you pay in taxes and what you receive in terms of services and benefits. We often do these kinds of exercises and say, we in California are paying far more than we're getting back in services from the federal government, which in the first place is an impossible kind of question to answer because how do you divide up national defense and those things anyway? So it's kind of a purely academic exercise. There's no obligation whatsoever for you as an individual or any particular state or locality to be getting back some equivalency to what we've paid in. Taxes is the area where, in fact, we finance public services that we want everybody to enjoy regardless of ability to pay. So that's what I mean when I talk about general services and benefits to people. So this is how we finance public schools because it's a value to us in a community that everybody get a public education regardless of their ability to pay for that public education. And it's important that we support public education. We all get a benefit of that, even if we don't have kids in schools, because we all benefit from a well-educated populace. Preaching to the choir, I'm sure, on that kind of thing, but you get the idea. And it's just not practical to fund some of these public services from fee basis or other than taxes. Imagine if you tried to fund your police department on a fee basis. Only those that use police services, law enforcement services, or get the benefit of them, only those people have to pay proportionally to how much they use the service. And that makes no sense. Imagine somehow we would have to tag every car that goes through an intersection where there's a motorcycle cop sitting there calming the traffic, you know, and I mean, there's no practical way to do that. It doesn't make any sense. And we don't want there to be a disincentive for people to call the fire department if they need fire services, because I might get a bill in the mail if I call the fire department. So I'm just going to let my house or my neighbor's house burn down. No, we don't want that. We want those services to be used when they're needed. And so they're tax-supported services largely. Some components of those services, like, say, fire inspections, make sense for those to be applied more on a fee basis as opposed to tax-supported. But this is a key public policy kind of a debate, actually. If you look at any particular service, how much of this should be supported by fees that the user pays? How much of this should be supported by the general public because there's a public benefit? And to the extent that we support things from general taxes, that's a measure of what we perceive to be the public benefit of making sure that service is provided. For example, recreation services. If we cost up the total amount of charges for what it takes to provide this Zumba class, then we're a little more than providing a private sector class. But if we're providing that as a city in the senior center, because we want seniors to get better exercise in the community, there's a public benefit to having that available to people regardless of ability to pay, then we probably establish a policy that says 20%, 33%, that's what will set the fee, something nominal, and the rest will pay out of the general fund because we want people to enjoy this class and pay something nominal maybe, but not the full cost. So we share things. Okay, back to taxes. Cities in California can impose any kind of a tax that's not otherwise prohibited by state law. This sounds pretty wide open, right? But the landscape is very well carved up for what taxes the state has occupied for itself and what taxes are available for localities to adopt. Cities in California cannot adopt income taxes, cannot adopt personal income taxes, cannot adopt alcohol taxes, cannot adopt cigarette taxes. These are all areas that the state over time has said, no, this is an area of statewide taxation and cities need to get out of it. But there are a number of other local taxes that are much more common. And of course, property taxes go only to local governments. We'll talk about that in a moment. We have some other options available as well. We'll get into the palette of those. And then the other key kind of thing to know about taxation. Yeah, yes, Steve, jump in.
Question, interesting. Alcohol tax.
Yeah.
Gasoline. Gasoline is the locality can put a tax on it, or it's federal and state, I guess.
Yeah.
So they've allowed that split, not California specific.
Yeah.
Why did it develop that these other areas, I can understand you can't take away from the state, but why can't you piggyback?
Yeah, because the state said that's our area of taxation. And so alcohol taxation, at one time there were local taxes, and it's partly that the business and corporate environment said, this is driving us crazy. We have all these different local taxations, and it's nuts, and it's not fair to the consumer. There needs to be a standard taxation statewide. And the state said, okay, we're going to take over that area of taxation, and we're going to occupy that, and you all are out of it. The state legislature could allow personal income taxes, but it doesn't. Frankly, I don't think we want that at the local level, because we would probably have to adopt, I mean, some states, localities in some other states do that. That's how they're financed. But it's a nightmare. I mean, we would have to piggyback on the state's base of taxation, which is very progressive, very volatile. Look at what's going on with the state budget. It's difficult to manage the volatility because it's such a progressive tax on the upper income brackets. I don't think we want to be in that game. And rather, as you'll see as we talk about, we're very fortunate actually to be in the property tax realm. State policymakers, when they look at trying to come up with some way to make the state revenues more manageable and less volatile, some folks come up, well, maybe if we got into the property tax game as well. They have to change the Constitution to do that. But we stay out of our way. The property taxes does well for local governments. It's predictable, relatively stable, a good horse to ride. So, yeah. So general and special taxes, and this comes out of Proposition 13, Proposition 218, and sort of the long history of amendments to the state constitution since 1978 that make this distinction, and court decisions related to that along the way, that make this distinction between a general purpose tax, which requires majority of voter approval to increase, extend beyond a sunset date, or expand to a new class of user. So if you have a tax, let's say a local utility user tax on telephone services at a time when telephones were things that were plugged into the wall. Anybody remember that? Yeah. There was a time. But now this newfangled technology comes along, and these are wireless phones that work over a cell system, and they're not plugged into the wall, but you wrote your legal ordinance to talk about we're taxing telephones that are plugged into the wall. Whoops, that new kind of telephone service, though it's seemingly related and of a similar kind, doesn't fall into the tax. So you have to change your ordinance. And Prop 13 says if you're expanding to a new class of user, and expanding that utility user tax to cover wireless telephones, then that takes a vote of the people. And it's a majority vote if you're using those revenues for general purposes, going into the general fund. And it's 2/3 vote if you earmark it for specific purposes. And then we have parcel taxes, which are non-ad valorem, not value-based taxes on property, like Measure T. Set amount per parcel, dollar amount per parcel, non-ad valorem. And those require 2/3 vote too. They're kind of called out separately in the Constitution. Why? Because the people that wrote Prop 13 were most concerned about property. That was their principle. They were property owners most concerned about property. That's the only answer I can give. The parcel taxes are different. And that, in the case of parcel taxes, even if the city proposed a general purpose parcel tax, let's say $50 per parcel, but we're going to put it in the general fund, it's still 2/3 vote because it's a tax on property. It's a parcel tax, even if it's general purpose. Okay, so that's that. All that so far. Now, Prop 26 that came about in 2010, which was motivated by a thing about regulatory fees, so that's sort of more history about why we have this, but it is established into the state constitution this structure. This basically legal construct that starts with everything is a tax and then provides except these things. And so it provides exceptions. And basically, for the most part, ratified existing law, court cases and such, about the structure of fees and law, although it made certain changes, and that was the real reason why the writers of it put it into the law. But regardless, what we have now in the state constitution under Proposition 26 is that anything is a tax, that any charge or imposition by the government, and there's a local section and a state section, any charge or exaction is a tax unless it falls into one of these exceptions. So I've kind of put these into these categories. The first exception would be a user fee or an assessment. Assessment is a charge on property that is used to provide for a certain privilege or benefit or a service or product provided to the fee payer or to the property on which it's charged. So water fees, sewer fees, those sorts of things. Proposition 218, as you know, you've already been getting into it, has specific provisions for what we call property-related fees, but other kinds of fees and charges also fall into this category. So a second category might be regulatory fees. So building permits might be the most classic example here. And this would be a charge for a regulatory activity, regulatory inspections and those kinds of things. And one of the things that Proposition 26 did, the key thing that it did actually, is inserted into this kind of charge the requirement that the charge may not be used for something that's not a service to the regulated activity. So you can't, for example, charge a fee on liquor stores to do an inspection to see that they're properly carrying out the sales of liquor and then use part of those revenues for AA programs. That's maybe related, but it's not a service to the regulatory, it's not a regulatory inspection, regulatory process, unless that fee existed prior to Prop 26 in 2010. So they kind of closed up that little loophole because there was creative things going on in local government, as often happens. Anyway, so the key thing about these two provisions is they also carry legal language that says that fees may not be used to pay, they're limited to the reasonable cost of the activity. You don't have to charge on an actual basis, but the reasonable estimate of what that building inspection is going to cost. And then you can't be collecting more than it actually costs for service, or that's a reflection that your fees are excessive and they're not reasonably related to what the actual costs are. And you can't provide a service free to someone where other people are being charged. So you can't say, well, Mrs. McGillicuddy, because she's over 60 years old, gets to have free fire inspection. Well, how do you pay for that fire inspection then? You can't pay for it from fire inspection fees that are charged on somebody else. So if you're going to do that, you can do that, but you have to pay for it from the general fund. And this kind of goes back to what we talked about with the purpose of the general benefit idea of taxation, right? If you're essentially doing that and providing a program that gives Mrs. McGillicuddy free fire inspections, then you, as a matter of policy, the city council that's establishing that rule is saying that there's a public benefit to us all of making sure that Mrs. McGillicuddy, who's over 60, can get her free fire inspection done regardless of her ability to pay because she's over 60, which isn't that old actually. So anyway, another category that's not a tax, rents. We haven't called these fees, but a rental, a charge for the use of government property, entrance to museums, renting out the council chambers for something, renting out a community center for something. And this is a separate category than the other fees, what I would call rents, because there's not a cost limitation on this one. So for a rent, for a charge for facility or property, it doesn't carry the language that says it has to be limited to costs or reasonability or anything. You basically can charge market rate. Look at what the optimists are charging there, the Oddfellows are charging at the hall, and kind of do a survey, and kind of do what's market. There's no even requirement that you do that, but basically what folks do is charge something that's reasonable market rate. And you don't have to figure out if you're collecting more than the actual cost of services. Most folks kind of look at that as a matter of course and think about, what does it cost to us to pay for the cleanup and custodial and the keeping the lights on and all that kind of stuff. But you don't even have to worry about that actually in terms of meeting the law, in terms of matching up with revenue. Fines, forfeitures, penalties are not taxes. They're based on some particular violation of a particular rule or law. And then a payment that's not imposed by a local government. This is what municipal finance attorneys call sort of the silent exception. Because of the overall provision up above, as you'll notice, is any levy, charge, or exaction of any kind imposed. Well, what if it's not imposed? What if a charge that's not imposed? What would that be? Well, maybe some kind of an agreement or a contribution. Revenues that aren't imposed, aren't required to be paid, but are done. So the thought is, and this is not thoroughly tested in the courts, but the thought is that there's sort of a category of revenues out there that also doesn't fall into taxes because it's not an imposition that somebody has to pay.
Can you give us some examples of that?
Well, possibly development agreements. Possibly a development agreement because a developer doesn't have to pay that amount. He's doing it by agreement. Darian, you have some ideas here? Darian, deals with this quite a bit.
Well, there was the plastic bag fee, and that was the actual case. We actually had the supermarket collect the fee for the plastic bag, not the city itself. So that's the precedent that is trying. But developer fees are accepted anyway for a separate exception.
Yeah.
As well. So there's sort of a double.
Double exception because one property. Yeah.
But it's probably not an exception that we can do a lot with.
Yeah.
So it's safe to say this is not a major contributor to revenue statewide.
No, not a major one. Yeah. So whether something is a tax or a fee, what category it falls into, becomes really important in terms of approval requirements and how you work with it. And again, we're talking about the law here. And the approval requirements, as I mentioned, for general purpose taxes, it's majority voter approval. Well, the library district is a special purpose agency. The school district is a special purpose agency. They don't have the authority to do a general purpose tax and majority vote because they're special purpose agencies. The cities and counties are. We do multiple functions and we're considered to be general purpose agencies. So majority voter approval for a general purpose tax is available in cities or counties. 2/3 voter approval for a partial tax or special tax I talked about. And then we have general obligation bonds. This is like the school bonds that we're all familiar with that have a special provision that they can be approved if they fall within certain limits at 55%. But for cities, counties, and special districts that want to pass a general obligation bond, it takes 2/3 voter approval. And this is the one way that the 1% maximum property tax rate under Proposition 13, we'll get into this further perhaps, can be exceeded. The weird little history about this is, just really quickly, there was actually a 2/3 vote requirement in the state constitution of 1879. It was actually required that to increase the tax rate and to authorize a general obligation bonds financing, where you're taking out a loan from Wall Street and then agreeing on a contract basically to pay it back over time from this revenue source, was something that was considered to be special even back in 1879 before there were votes required for other forms of taxation. So why, I always ask my students, is general obligation bond so special that it's 2/3 vote, and we also had it all the way back more than 100 years ago? Well, it's the intergenerational aspect to it. With a tax, even for example, Measure Q, a future city council could say, actually the way Measure Q is written, a future populace could say, we don't want to have the tax anymore, we're going to reduce it. If you're doing a bond obligation, general obligation, bond obligation, you're entering into a contract which binds future generations and future city councils on that. So that intergenerational obligation is what people see as the need for a higher vote threshold. Now, as you may know, there's Proposition 5 coming up on the November ballot, which would, if approved, reduce that vote threshold for cities and counties and special districts for general obligation bonds down to 55%. Special districts, school districts don't have ability to do a general purpose tax, but they can do 2/3 voter approval for a parcel tax or other, if there's other kind of special taxes available in some cases. And then likewise, general obligation bond rules are there. But in all cases, fees or rents or fines, forfeitures adopted by the governing body may be approved by the governing body. Majority vote of the governing board in most cases. Now, Prop 218, as you know already, property-related fees, there's certain other processes, majority vote protest procedures and all sorts of things that you have to go through. But basically, it's majority vote of governing board for most kinds of fees and charges. And the state, as you may know, in order to raise taxes, requires 2/3 vote of each house of the legislature. So that's important there as well. But the state can do a general obligation bond with majority voter approval of the state. Distinction there, though, is that's not a tax increase. So there's 2 general obligation bonds, an education bond and a parks bond on the ballot, Propositions 2 and 4. Those are basically authorizing the state to, in each case, do a $10 billion bond for education facilities, for parks and water and other kinds of facilities. There's no tax increase there. It's simply authorizing the financing and then authorizing the state to obligate itself for future debt service for those, to paying off those bonds. Okay.
Can I ask, so the only...
Yes, please jump in.
I didn't want to interrupt us along the way, so yeah, so I'll save some of it for you, but, so only the city and counties in your chart here have general purpose tax capability. Any other district, any other local agency you can think of, out of luck for that?
Yeah, because they're special.
That's a powerful authority left in the city and counties. And that's true for charter cities. Charter cities haven't been given any special taxing powers that you're aware of?
They have, there's one unique taxing authority remaining for charter cities, different than local governments. And that is, there is what's called a documentary transfer tax. This is the tax you pay on the transfer of property. It's actually on the documents. It's based on the value of the property that's being transferred, but it's a tax on the documents. It's, ancient tax. And that is limited in state law. It's something that in Davis, like most other cities, we get, because we're a general law city, we get 55% per 100,000 or for $100, 55 cents per $100, something like that. And then the other half goes to the county, 55 cents to the county. In charter cities have the ability to adopt with a vote of the people, because again, general purpose tax, it would be general majority vote. They have the authority to adopt what's called a property transfer tax, which is imposed in the same way. It's based on the value of property, but it can be much higher. So there are many charter cities that have that. And there's one city this November, I can't remember what city it is, some city in Southern California that's actually put on the ballot two measures, one to become a charter city and the other to adopt a property transfer tax. It's a challenging tax because you imagine you might, it's not very common, or even though it's a tax on property, because real estate agents don't like it, and the best advertisers and communicators with the public I know of are real estate agents. So
every time for these areas that are imposing that tax, there's a real estate transaction changes hands, buyer, seller, deed gets recorded. Under that point, the tax is extracted based on the value of the property.
Yes.
That money then gets distributed. So this, I guess the theory behind it is, it's a revenue raiser because the revenue exceeds the actual cost of the county services to deal with that property transaction.
yeah, I mean, and this is a tax, so there's no worry about cost. It just goes in the general fund. Yeah, and it can be a substantial amount of money. So cities that have high ones, of course, are San Francisco, Berkeley, Oakland, a lot of Bay Area cities have these charges.
Yeah, and it's probably for the buyer and seller, what are they going to do about it? They're stuck, right? They probably don't even know about it once they process it and they see that their final totals, they see it. But.
Yeah. That's really the one area that's unique. There's a provision of state law adopted in the 90s, I think, or maybe the late 80s, that essentially says that general law cities have all of the tax capabilities that charter cities do. But this particular provision just comes out of an odd way that I think it's Prop 13 was written.
Prop 62.
Is it? Prop 62, yes, which is, that's another story. Only survives with this, yeah. So, okay.
Thank you.
So sure. So budget, what's a budget? Y'all know what a budget is, but it's more than accounting. What a lot of people think of is when a budget, they just think of tracking your expenses. But the importance of a budget is that it's a financial plan. It gets you to think and create a strategy, establish a policy for what's important to a community, where you're going to spend your limited resources, how much resources do you have. So it's both revenues and expenditures, thinking about our best estimate of what we're going to be able to bring in, and then our best intentions about how to allocate out these revenues in a strategic fashion. It reflects the policies and priorities and the needs of the particular communities. It also reflects how we want to provide those services. So more money to police, but budget might also have, we want to do some of these functions that are traditionally law enforcement kinds of things with non-sworn officers. Maybe we can do something in the area of responding to domestic violence calls or something with people that are specializing in that particular thing, something like that. So that kind of difference in approach to how we provide services is also going to be reflected in the budget and give an approach. How cities are going to be paid for? Are you going to use one-time revenues for one-time kinds of expenditures, which would be wise? Are you going to set aside how much revenues into the reserves to deal with uncertainties in the future? All of these kinds of policies are reflected in there. And then the financial reports and audits is more a reflection about what happened. Did we account for things properly? Is this a fair representation of where monies were spent? Both of these documents can be very informative, especially, I would say, in the messages that are provided by the city manager and the finance people about what is really going on, that really give meat to the bones. And the footnotes, don't ignore the footnotes, they're very informative and helpful. But these documents will not provide you with the answers about, is this city healthy or not? It's not enough information. There's a lot more to that question, and it's not a simple as one or two or three numbers picked out of the budget or even in the financial statements. Then we can get into financial health and how to diagnose that and determine that in another section. So in government financial operations, and this is sort of, there are nationwide standards with these, Government Finance Officers Association, and there are standards about how to allocate revenues. And your city had consistently told me that your recent financial statements received the governor GFOA Award of Excellence for presentation and accuracy, and the budgets also received those. You meet these standards for how to account for things, then you comply with basic standards. These things are not written into law. They're professional standards. And the way we allocate or account for revenues in California is a fund accounting basis. And it's again, one of the things that's very much driven by law and the color of the revenues that you're bringing in. So where the money comes from and what the rules are for it determines how it can be spent and determines how we account for it. If it's general purpose in nature, doesn't have strictures on how it can be allocated, we put it into the general fund. That's what we call a governmental fund. And if we have a particular rule for how it should be spent, like the local streets and roads funds that we get allocated to us from the state gasoline tax, those have to be put into what's called a special revenue fund, because we have to be able to show the public and the state auditors that we're spending those monies only for what they're legally limited to be spent for, streets and roads, and certain practical strictures even within that. So we have special revenue funds for funds that are earmarked in some particular way, so we can account for them and carefully show how the costs match up with and the purposes. That provides accountability. Proprietary funds are funds that are accounted for and for operations that are more business-like, commodity type operations, water funds, utility funds, and such. The accounting for these is slightly different because they operate more like businesses, and there's more of a fee for service on most of the things that they do. And they're called proprietary funds. And these roll up in the government statements to a sort of master summary called governmental-wide, agency-wide roll-up, which to me is sort of interesting but not particularly informative. If you really want to get to what's going on, you have to look at these individual kinds of funds, depending on what you're particularly interested in at the fund level. So earlier I said that generalizations are perilous in California because there's so much diversity, but we have to start somewhere. So this is a mashup of all of the city revenues in California. If we look at sort of the weighted average of what cities are providing, this is sort of color-coded. The purple stuff is fees, largely utility fees and fees for services. The green stuff is taxes, and so we see special taxes and benefit assessments there. And federal and state grants, monies given to local governments, are the teal things. These are things on this left side of this donut that are all earmarked for specific purposes, and the rest of the stuff, the not restricted stuff, are things that we're going to find in the general fund. And, whoa, that's where all the green is. That's where all the general purpose tax revenues are. Largely property tax and sales taxes, and Davis is very much similar in this regard. And as you go, you'll want to sort of compare Davis to this sort of mashup of what average cities are. But one of the things that you'll see in this stack here is utility user taxes. Davis doesn't have a utility user tax. It's considered a fairly regressive tax, but many cities that have it, it's a sales tax on utility services, basically, and can generate a lot of revenues, but is seen as, even though most cities that have it provide for exemptions, if you want to apply for a senior exemption or a low income exemption, there's programs with PG&E and other electric utilities that you can apply for, and most cities say if you satisfy the requirements of PG&E, just bring your certificate in and we'll let you go from the city utilities as well. But anyway, all of these taxes are key for the general fund. If we look at just the general purpose revenues, just the discretionary stuff, that's sort of the right side of that donut, property taxes, sales taxes, utility user taxes, and compare that to what things might look like in a full-service city. There we go. You see, on the expenditure side, where we're spending typically money in the general fund. And in most cities, fire and police, public safety services are going to be well over half of the city's general fund. Davis is even a little bit unusual in the sense that the parks and recreation, because it's such a value in this community, is a larger proportion compared to the average. But again, police and fire, you'll see, is a fairly large chunk here. And of course, if you are a non-full service city, like Rancho Cordova, and you don't have a fire department, then you can just kind of draw a line across the top there, and they would be getting less property tax share, because property tax is going to the fire district instead. So this is kind of an illustration of what the city goes through at budget time when it deals with the general fund and trying to balance the general fund. You're looking at how much revenue is coming down on the left side, what's the economy doing to our sales tax, our property tax, and then how do we balance it out on the right side. And what I generally kind of say is that you can look at what a city is spending out of its general fund on streets or library hours and those kinds of things. Those are the indicator species. Because if they're really getting into fire and police, law enforcement tends to be the top priority, public safety, then you know the city's getting into real trouble if it's making deep cuts into those functions.
And so, I mean, just in terms of just looking at this, right, I mean, fire and police would generally need to be spent out of general taxes.
Yes.
And that is going to, might be hard to do, given the amount of general tax that's generated on average.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question on, in your utility user tax, is this a good example where you said potentially there's exceptions you might have to that tax for seniors, but those exceptions then would be paid for by the general fund?
Well, because it's a tax, you don't have, it's unlike a fee.
So
Yeah.
if it were a fee, it'd be different, but
Right.
so it's considered a tax.
Yes. Utilities, it's a tax, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
We actually looked at that last year.
Yeah. If it was a fee, then it would have to be for some kind of service provided to the fee payer. So it's pretty hard to structure, the fee is basically, it's the property related fee that you're charging for the service. So you're already doing that for a city service. Cities charge these utility user taxes on private utilities, so on cable, on gas, electric, telephone is very common. But they can also charge them on city operating funds as well, on your own enterprises. Sacramento does this, and there was when I was in the city of Sacramento when Prop 218 came along in 1996, the city manager at the time decided we would put on the ballot, we put our property transfers on the ballot, and we were transferring money out of the enterprise funds at the time. We would make sure that they were approved as utility taxes, and that passed, and so they've survived legally. But anyway, so yeah, utility charges that are not going to the services of the utility must be approved as taxes, yeah. Okay, so now we get to property taxes. In California, property tax is a very sacred thing. It's an ad valorem tax in California. That's what the property tax means. It means value-based, fancy Latin for value-based. Imposed on real property and tangible personal property. Maximum 1% rate, that's in Prop 13 of assessed valuation as defined, plus voter-approved rates to fund debt. Ironically, I was telling you about the 1879 Constitution where the voter-approved rates, Proposition 13 actually obliterated the ability to do general obligation bonds and to add that additional rate. It was just maybe an oversight, maybe they just didn't care. So that had to be put back into through an amendment to Prop 13 with Proposition 46 in 1986, which actually restored the ability for us to do general obligation bonds at 2/3 vote. Anyway, assessed valuation is capped at 1975-76 rates plus inflation rate or 2%, whichever is higher. Inflation has actually been lower than that in some years. And so if my property, even though it's not changing hands, we have a low inflation rate, I get a lower tax increase because inflation is super low, below 2%, even though, and you never capture that back. There's no sort of catch-up provision on that. Until my property sells, and then it's benched at the market value. And so property taxes actually, in terms of a revenue source, actually do fairly well. It's not, property taxes overall, in terms of revenues, don't increase at just 2% a year. That's just the individual property that's not sold, because there's turnover. And turnover kicks these things that may have been, sitting there at this lower taxed value to market value. Boom, there's a big increase in revenues that are thrown off from that property that new owner's going to be paying. That turnover helps to keep property tax revenues growing at a fairly reasonable rate over time. From 7 to 10% a year is typical.
I was going to ask, how predictable is that?
Well, it's pretty predictable. And this is why I don't like the state income tax, because it's not so predictable. Even sales tax is more volatile and hard to predict. Property tax revenues, you establish a good relationship with your assessor who keeps an eye on these kinds of things and sees properties coming along. It is a year and a half or so before you will see showing up in the city revenues the changes that are happening in the property tax roll that the county assessor starts to see. Because it takes time for those new assessed values to be applied to those new property owners, and then for the collections and the payments to be made, and then the allocations. So we have a fair amount of foresight. Property tax is relatively predictable and not as volatile. When you think about when the market values go way up in property taxes, Prop 13 keeps the revenues fairly stable. I mean, there's turnover, and that's going to affect things somewhat. But it's going to have a very moderating effect, at least on properties that don't change hands. And also when things are going down, it has a moderating effect as well. So, yeah. Property tax is reassessed at full value on change in ownership, and of course, new construction value adds to the value of the property. Property that declines in value can be assessed at a lower market value. It used to be, decades ago before computers, that assessors, even though they're elected, most of them, would wait, until they get appeals. And they still respond to appeals from property owners and say, hey, I'm suffering here. The market value of my property has just dropped because I'm a business and I can't sell office space anymore because everybody wants to work from home, right? So the property value drops, and if it drops below the taxable value, then the assessor can rebench that downward. And then that property value can increase in future years at the market value until it reaches that Prop 13 limit value. So there is a kind of a catch-up when it comes to individual properties that have fallen below market value and are rebenched lower in that rate. It's kind of catch-up. So we've seen that in some cases, and in the downturns in the housing market, and it can take years for these values to come back. The allocation of property tax is shared among local entities. So cities, counties, special districts, and schools. Property taxes do not cross county lines. If you look at the state budget and their revenues, no property tax revenues in the state budget. Not as a revenue. Now, property taxes very much affect state finances because, what? Schools. The state is ultimately responsible for funding schools, and so as property tax revenues improve for schools, it reduces the burden of the state to make sure they meet their minimum guarantee of funding for schools, and the reverse is true too. But these are local revenues allocated among cities, counties, and special district schools within the county that they're collected. They don't cross county lines, and none of it goes up to the state. And these shares really vary. And it so happens that Davis's rate, as you'll see, is 21% of the share roughly. And that includes a number of different types of property tax revenues. But this really varies quite a bit it's really based on what the property tax rates were for a particular city back in the 70s when Prop 13 came along and sort of froze everything. And those rates, in some ways, were based on a higher assessed valuation community maybe didn't need as high a rate, so they didn't charge as much. or they had a huge commercial sector that threw off property tax revenues that they didn't need to charge as much, or they didn't do as much because they didn't have a fire department. They weren't responsible for paying for fire, so the fires levied the property tax rate on top of the city rate. So you have different sorts of rates in different communities. So let's talk about sales tax. I'm just going to hit the biggies here.
Can I ask a question?
Yes,
I'm kind of
please.
curious.
Yeah.
So what happens for rural communities that haven't been incorporated? They're not cities, but they're in Neola County. Where does that money, does the city piece of the pie evaporate and then the county picks up?
Yeah, essentially the county gets it.
Get that. So what happens to places like El Macero? Is that what essentially goes? I know they have services from the city, but the
Yeah.
property tax goes to the county. And
Property tax goes to the county. And the county is responsible for providing city services in unincorporated areas.
But yeah, and those city services are not being, they're covered through a different mechanism versus
Yeah.
this ad valorem property tax.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, well, the county's doing it, and this is part of that.
I think, well, I was gonna ask you,
Yeah.
that feels like an advantage to the county in a way that seems inconsistent with how this pie comes out in general for other properties.
Yeah, that's a really interesting discussion to get into.
Yeah.
And there's a whole thing about property tax sharing when the city incorporates or annexes things, and it's a hot topic. And, you know, generally, you could say, I think from observation, and El Macero may be an exception, but most unincorporated areas do not have the level of city services or streets and sidewalks or standards that cities do. So
Yeah, so that's the exact point. These are unique rural areas.
Yeah.
Well, thankfully, it's not the city of Dunnigan, or that's others,
Mhm.
right? So, anyway, yeah, okay, thank you for sharing.
Sure. So sales taxes, very topical, of course, at this time. The state gets 6%, and then there's allocations for local government, and then there's add-on, what we call transactions of use taxes legally, we call add-on sales taxes, a kind of a sales tax. The state tax is essentially 6 cents, 6%, and pieces of that are set aside, rather than going to the state general fund, they're put into special funds at the state level. We've already talked about what a special fund is. And they're thereby get around the rules of Proposition 98 about allocation of revenues, certain percentages to schools. So those revenues go directly down to counties to provide various services that the state has delegated for counties to carry out. Law enforcement services, health and human services, probation services that were realigned down to counties. Short answer there. And then the local amounts, there's the 1%, what we call Bradley Burns, after the 1955 Act, which established the right of cities to adopt this rate. All cities in California went ahead and adopted this rate, but that 1% is actually a city-imposed rate. It's not just the state allocating out. Every city in California adopted and imposed legal rates, so it's city-imposed, locally imposed rate. And then there's a 0.25% rate that goes to counties called the Transportation Development Act, which is spent for transportation goes to counties, local amount rate, and then any add-on transaction and use taxes. And these taxes are situs-based. So for the local, state amount it doesn't matter so much, but for the local rate, these are based on where the transaction occurs. So if you go to, the amount of, the taxable sales that happen within the city of Davis, that then leads to how much Bradley Burns local sales tax we get. And that's a very interesting issue because how do we define where a transaction occurs? It's easy if I go down to Ace Hardware and buy a bucket of bolts right here. The product, the seller, the purchaser, me are all in the same location. But if I go on Amazon, or let's say I go on Best Buy and buy a bucket of bolts on Best Buy, then the Best Buy is actually located in Dinuba. So the origin, the location of the seller is there, I'm here, and the product could be at a warehouse in the Central Valley someplace. Which place gets that local tax revenue? Well, that has to be defined in law. That's where the rules are. In California, and this is not true in other states necessarily, different states define it differently if they do a sales tax. California, we define the source of that, or the transaction to have occurred at the origin, that is where the seller is. And the reason of this goes back to times when we didn't have computers and we wanted to make it easier on the folks that were collecting the revenue to do it without paying. It's a lot easier to tell a seller who's collecting the tax, all you have to determine is, you know, where you're located and what the tax rate is in your location, as opposed to figuring out how much of your taxable sales went to all these different locations. So it's based on the location of the seller. The challenge with that, of course, is that now we have this growing amount of online sales. And so a lot of those sales tax revenues for transactions that I make from sitting at my computer here in Davis to the Best Buy online and that sales tax is not coming to Davis. The Bradleyburg sales tax is going to Dinuba. Very controversial issue because Dinuba, I hate to pick on Dinuba, there are many others as well, but many of these cities have been perhaps strong-armed into deals where they are kicking back a portion of those sales tax revenues back to the retailer. So the retailer says, if I'm going to locate in your community, I want to get this tax sharing agreement, and they get a bunch of revenue back. There's a very good video on this that I highly commend you to see. I looks like Darian's already seen it. Done by Bloomberg Tax. They've done a number of articles on this by Laura Mahoney, their reporter there. If you Google Bloomberg California tax deals, Bloomberg California tax deals, at least for me, this is the first thing that comes up. Yeah, and you'll see this video right at the top there. It's a 10-minute video, and it's really interesting. Very well done on this particular topic. The good news is these add-on sales taxes, like Measure Q, are different. They are called transactions and use taxes, technically and legally. It's a different section of the state law. It's going to be a different section of your ordinance, of your city ordinance. Already is a different section of your city ordinance because it's allocated differently. Transactions and use taxes, wisely, because they're a more recent tax, perhaps, are allocated on a destination basis. So it doesn't matter for the bucket of bolts that I'm buying at Ace Hardware, same, you know, it's just like the sales tax is the same, it increases. But if I make that transaction for that bucket of bolts with Best Buy down in Dinuba, then the Best Buy has to look at what the sales tax rate is in Davis to determine if there's a transaction and use tax that applies at the destination where it's sending me the bucket of bolts because I'm the purchaser. And since we have a transaction and use tax here, they're going to collect that and send it to the city of Davis.
When it's an interstate sale, and the laws are in conflict,
Yeah.
how is that resolved?
So interstate, and this has changed in recent years. I have a whole module on this. We can spend a little more time with it if you're really interested in sales tax stuff. That's a little bit different. Because of the recent decision authored by Justice Kennedy and his last hurrah before leaving the court, he had suggested that maybe he was interested in looking at a change in the federal law which didn't allow states to force retailers to collect on transactions where the retailer is located out of state. Kennedy said, come on, we're in a digital age. If you're doing a whole lot of business in California, even if you don't have brick and mortar presence, I think that's presence. I think that's commercial presence. And so they changed the law. This is called the Wayfair decision. And it's fascinating because it had to do with the states of North Dakota overturning the law or South Dakota overturning the law that had to do with North Dakota because remote sales are very important for those smaller states, I guess. Anyway, we implemented a law called AB 147, which establishes a program and requires retailers that are out of state to collect these taxes on transactions where the purchaser is located in state. So we're doing that's really bumped revenue statewide. We've seen a lot of good collections from out-of-state transactions now. This is actually categorized as what's called use tax. So the tax has always been there. You know, you can really get me going on this kind of stuff. 1935, California, 1933, we adopted the sales tax in California. And then in 1935, we adopted a thing called the use tax, which basically said, even though we didn't have computers at the time, if you're doing a purchase of a tractor parts for some guy in Nevada, because that's where the tractor parts are, then we want you to pay the sales tax on where you're using that product. So there was an understanding that even at the time, a use tax should apply where a sales tax didn't. So technically, these transactions from out-of-state retailers have always been due. And actually, businesses in California have been audited for a long time by the State Board of Equalization and now the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration on their reporting and payment of these use taxes. It's just that there was no enforcement mechanism to get the retailers to collect it, which makes life a whole lot easier. Because I talk about this thing constantly and have been for many years, I actually work with my local tax accountant to fill out the form that says how much did you spend on taxable goods from out of state that you didn't pay sales tax on, and then I pay the use tax. I used to do that with my income taxes every year on a special form, right? You may have seen that form. I don't have to do that anymore because all these retailers that I'm purchasing from out of state are now collecting the tax. So that's all good news. We're doing that. That's the good news of it. But again, the transactions and use tax is a better tax even in that sense. Because the other wrinkle is that out-of-state use taxes are dumped into an account called a pool at the state level for the county of Yolo County. So that Bradley Burns use tax, 1%, instead of it all coming to Davis, even though Davis is getting the full 1% transaction and use tax on that deal, the 1% Bradley Burns tax is shared with Woodland and Winters and the county. It doesn't make any sense. Again, it's an arcane old rule, and it's not a law, it's a rule of the BOE and the CDTFA that remains today to make life simpler on the retailer, because they only had to count to 58 instead of 483 plus counties. So in terms of figuring out what the tax would be that's due.
Yeah, a lot of nuances to this.
Yeah.
Very, very much so. On this transaction tax, do you have an opinion based on this Dinuba example?
Mm-hmm.
How effectively is this really administered if you're in a city that has one of these use taxes and their purchases outside? Is this something that is administered in a way that the city's actually going to see that? Maybe it's a tough question. I don't know.
How good a job are we doing?
Yeah, how good a job?
Yeah. It's, I think it's being done very well, actually, and for two reasons. CDTFA has a pretty good staff. As I mentioned, it's in the state's interest to do a good job of this. Yeah. So they really work hard on this. And there's a lot of hammering on them and oversight from local governments. There's a whole cottage industry, a couple of big firms, one in particular, I think may have to do some work for Davis, that make a business of looking and seeing if Davis is getting what it's due. And are there other ways for Davis to take advantage of the tax system and sales tax?
Good answer.
Yeah.
I want to ask one more question.
Sure.
So is there any evidence out there about buyers looking around for the lowest sales tax available that's, let's say, within a state, and then probably my guess is a no sales tax state like Oregon? There's a lot of evidence, I'm not sure, but I'm speculating evidence out there that you're going to buy your car in Oregon if you can. You're going to save on that. So
yeah.
What does the evidence show? Within the state, is there evidence that one city has an 8% sales tax and the other one has a 7%, that consumers are that savvy and they're shopping around or not?
Yeah, there's very little evidence of that. That makes any marginal difference at all.
Yeah.
Particularly.
But for the out-of-state, though, is there evidence?
So, and on the out-of-state thing, if you buy a boat or a car in Nevada and bring it into California and register it, you're going to pay the sales tax. The DMV is going to, well, it's a use tax. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons we have the use tax and have had it since 1935, is particularly for big items, artworks and other kinds of things that are brought in from out of state. If it's here, then you're supposed to pay
You pay it
the
later.
sales tax, yeah.
So Michael, first, I need to go home and put kids to sleep, so I just want to.
Yes.
On the transactions use tax, has any city like Davis, that's on the losing side of these sort of Bradford shenanigans, use the transactions use tax to compensate, right? If you're a retailer like Best Buy, who is not, sending back the sale to the real destination state and the destination city, and we in fact know which destination city is because you have to do yourself. So
Yeah, we know.
with the transaction tax, then we're going to increase the rate by 0.5%.
Yeah. Well,
I obviously it's too late to adjust the current, but I'm just curious. I don't see any particular. You're not discriminating against interstate commerce. You're discriminating against businesses that are, misallocating tax revenue from this jurisdiction.
well, they're just doing it according to law, as far as they're concerned, right? Because it's the origin, and they're just taking advantage of it.
Well, but the point is, in a lot of those cities, they're giving half the sales tax back
Yeah.
to Best Buy, and that is right. That's a payoff.
Yeah.
And it's cost everybody in the state, and there's no reason why the cities that are losing, and the CDTFA did a great report showing which cities are losing.
Hundreds of millions a year.
Yeah, shouldn't try, if the transaction use tax is already there,
Yeah.
to say, we're gonna presume that, I'm just curious, like, is that a thing out there, like? that's
Well, I think it's a thing to the
specific
extent
something?
that cities that are struggling with what revenue do we go to now, because we can see our sales tax is dipping and it's not strong, can look to the transaction use tax and say, whoa, that's stronger for us, because it's based on the purchases that are actually happening in our community, and now we're capturing that. Not just from rooftops and people purchasing in residence, but also from the commercial area, the businesses that are buying things from out of the city, outside the city. And so then you're capturing that, and it's much more durable for the future kind of tax. And that's the case here in Davis, right? I mean, Kelly was telling me, I don't study the Davis budget actually, but that your transaction and use tax revenues are much stronger than your Bradley Murray sales tax revenue.
And it's also consistent with the fact that we specifically don't locate a lot of big box retail in the city, right? So,
Yeah.
of course, we get a lot of stuff over Amazon,
Yeah.
or Williams-Sonoma, and all these, and Walmart, all these places have places in the Central Valley, and Apple and Cupertino. There's a lot of really problematic arrangements.
So that may be a good place for us to end for the evening. I mean, up to you if you want to continue to go.
Sorry.
I do want to give you this other slide. Had we more time, and if you would like to have more time at future meetings, there's some other topics we can go through. And there's some information in your handout as well. One is just sort of more of a history lesson about how these kinds of things happened over time. We can get more deeply into the sales use tax allocation. I have some charts which will help make this more clear. If you're like me, it took me hearing this 6 times to figure out the crazy thing about how sales tax is allocated in different ways. We can talk about transportation funding. We can talk about how do we answer the question, is our city financially healthy or not? What is a financially healthy city? What are signs of a city that's not financially healthy? Pensions, a basic introduction there on what are our pension system and concerns. That's a big issue, of course, for cities. Capital financing, different ways to come up with money to build infrastructure. Financial impacts of new development, a hot topic as well. One of my early college teachers, Dean Mazinski, coined the phrase fiscalization of land use, as if that was a negative, pejorative thing, and I always said, I like the term, and land use is fiscalized, because if you're being responsible, you think about how this new land use development is going to bring in new revenues and cause new costs, and how that affects the city's ability to provide services in the future. That's just something you should be considering. Fiscal impacts of new development, and local tax measures. I have a whole inventory of all the tax measures in California, which Davis has a couple on the ballot as well. So coming up. So it's been a pleasure being with you.
Thank you very much. Very, very, very helpful, and I'd be surprised if they don't ask you back. Appreciate the offer.
So you're going to take questions. We're going to do a Q&A.
Oh, yeah.
Is that okay with you? I would love to have that opportunity.
I can stick around if I'm English, yeah.
Can I ask these questions on this ending slide?
Yeah.
Are there answers to them on your California City Plans website?
There are, I think, it might be worthwhile actually having a presentation on it, though. It'll be hard for you to sort of, find stuff there that will be as helpful as a conversation.
I personally would love to hear about diagnosing municipal financial health.
Yeah.
If you don't mind. I don't want to interfere if other commissioners have questions.
I have some.
Oh, please go ahead, and I'll hold mine.
Okay, sure. Thought that's what you were suggesting. So, thanks for coming. That was a tour de force. And I have your book. Should have brought it. Could have brought it. Thanks for that. That was very lucid. There was a lot more to it. All very interesting. But I just going to ask a couple of general questions. So, your book and this handbook really focuses on the revenue side. What do you recommend on the expenditure side? Are there this kind of thought on the expenditure side? Are there best management practices that are out there that should be examined? Because that's kind of I'm giving you my bias. It seems like everybody's on the revenue side. But the expenditure side is more harder to deal with. It's rougher to deal with employee salaries. It's harder to deal with contract out with capital projects and consulting contracts.
Yeah.
So I don't know, what's your thought on that? Am I wrong on that? Or
No, you're not. It's a harder one to deal with in many ways. There are some topic areas which we can get into, like pensions. That's important to look into. But in terms of resources, and there's some of these are linked on my website. ICMA, the International City Management Association, has published a number of books and briefing papers on various topics, so it's worth looking at their website if you're interested in particular topics about the spending side and how to do things better or efficiency of particular topics. Government Finance Officer Association as well has some things. There's other ones listed on my site as well.
Okay, well, that's definitely worth a look. Something I'm interested in always thinking about being a government employee. How can you provide those government responsibilities on the cost side more effectively? And it's hard to do. So I get that. And it's hard to measure. The metrics are you raise the 1% sales tax, you can say we're going to get $10 million more a year, whatever the number is. You go out and try to have a more efficient contracting process.
Yeah.
And how are you going to measure that metric? So it's harder to deal with. Okay, I got a bunch of. I'm just going to ask one more.
Sure.
So this budget in brief is always very useful. One of the better things I think the city puts out for the public and for the commission here to take a look at. And one thing I'm always trying to measure is the total budget expenditures and put that in alignment with the number of city employees. It's a rough metric. Is there any analysis out there about what's the optimum balance between employees and budget, or is it employees per capita of population? What does the literature say about that?
I don't think there is a good. Yeah, and part of that is because there is there are different values in different communities. I did an incorporation study for the town of Ross in Lynn County one time, a little wealthy community near, town of Ross is an incorporated town. Kentfield, next to it. Kentfield has a fire district and everything, but they're an unincorporated area. And went over to Ross and interviewing them in their little town. It's a very small little community, and they have one fire truck and one fire engine company. And we asked a question. I was just 25 years old, rough under the elbows, and I said, why would you want your own fire department, one fire engine and truck and everything, when you could just merge with the Kentfield Fire Protection District next door, and it'd be so much more efficient? And I mean, it's obvious, right? And he said, we want our own name on our own fire truck.
good advertising.
Yeah. So, point being, there's some intangible elements in why we do things or how we do things and the choices that we make that make sort of these rough kind of numbers about employees per capita kind of, sort of brute force. We may choose to do things in a different way that may cost more because we value that more. We may build more expensive streets because we want to put in bike pathways and sidewalks here, and another community says we don't care that much about bike pathways.
Okay, so it's like snowflakes. Every analysis is going to be dependent, going to be different because it's going to depend.
Yeah.
So there's no optimization. It's really locally dependent. So okay.
It is locally dependent. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't ask the question.
Or ask the question a different way, compare
Yeah.
yourself to yourself. We make explicit choices that affect, are we getting better at operating within those choices?
Yeah.
I think is another way to look at it.
Yeah, and it is worth looking at how does San Ramon do this? How does Woodland do this? Maybe, and this is the value of your council members and your staff going to conferences and talking with their colleagues, because there's other ideas and best practices out there and things that there's always things to learn from. And maybe we go, oh, that's nice, but that's not going to really work in our community. Or maybe we go, wow, we should try that out. It's worth trying.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Thank you, and I don't want to, if other commissioners have questions, I will hold mine, so. Okay, very good. I just want to thank you. This has been absolutely fantastic, and I can't thank you enough. I want to just mention one thing that council has sort of toyed with the idea of vacancy taxes, either for commercial properties or residential or both. And I'm curious to know what's your sort of thought about whether those are an effective means of producing revenue? What are the policy implications of imposing those?
So these are fairly new. Only, I think, within the last, it's very recent, within the last decade. And there's just a few out there, cities that have tried this and have imposed it. I think Oakland has done something in this area, and there may be a few others. I could try to come up with a list. So I think the experience with them is very limited so far to see what they would do. My general kind of thought is, without knowing a lot about them so far, is that this would be something you might want to do more for policy reasons, as a way to deal with some concern you have about vacancies or an activity, as a regulatory kind of a tax. In other words, as opposed to a revenue raising measure. I think you need to think about it that way, rather than kind of trying to depend on it as a substantial revenue source. So I don't know. There's a lot of interesting legal and implementation questions to that, but there's some folks out there who are pioneering in the field, and it would be worth talking with and seeing how things are going. What was the other one more thing? Oh, it's obviously a tax, so right, as we know, require voter approval. It's something you would do. It can't be a property tax under Prop 13, but you could do a charge on the, it's a business operations tax essentially. Or you could do a parcel tax that's only limited to vacant property, a 2/3 vote. That would be a 2/3 vote. But if you did it as a business operations tax, charging it on the business, on the commercial operation of rental properties that are kept vacant, but that's a different landscape than maybe an owner-occupied property that's not occupied. How you implement that? I mean, there's a lot of questions I have about how this works.
Yeah,
right?
as do I, and because
Yeah.
you're talking, I'm thinking about the Prop 13 implications if
Right.
you impose it on residential property, and how would that play out?
Yeah, it would probably be, I think it's been done both ways, as a business operations tax and as a parcel tax. Obviously, parcel tax 2/3, so, yeah.
If you give me grace for one more, I'll ask one more.
Maybe grace for one more.
Okay. Happy not to ask it. So this been an issue that's been before the commissions before is the development fees. And for the city of Davis, and a fee that's set and then hasn't been escalated based on inflation in a while. I don't know if you've heard that. What's the common practice? Is there a common practice for cities? Do they have a built-in escalator clause based on consumer price index, or are the cities different? What's your sense of that?
Well, there's a lot of practice out there, but development impact fees, like other fees, need to be tied to the reasonable costs. And the other way to approach this is under, having a development impact fee schedule, but then to look at the use of development agreements, which then you can agree to anything in that agreement. And the development fee structure maybe just provides a structure, a beginning place.
Yeah, I get that. I'm kind of asking a different question.
Oh.
There's I'm asking it's a related question.
Yeah.
There's so much inertia on any city to try to go through these updates all the time on the fees.
Yeah.
Is there a community practice in some areas, okay, we're just gonna live with our reasonable fee increase if we tie it to inflation, because we've got a good argument that that's keeping up, because we did our cost study in 2009, and we can make a reasonable assumption that if we tie that to the inflation rate in the area, we're in good shape. If somebody wants to take us on that, have at it.
And I'm not an attorney, and attorneys
I
will...
don't trust my...
Yeah, attorneys will, as you know, David advised you that it's a matter of risk, and I think most attorneys in this area that I've heard will say, you can do that for a few years, but the farther you get away from an actual cost study, the more risk.
Right, so that's what I'm asking, is there a practice among, and this is where you have to track other cities, what are they doing? Are they willing to live with that risk, and they have that built in? So I don't know, so that's just my thought.
And I don't know how often development impact fees are updated in typical cities.
Yeah,
It's a
good question, all right, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much once again, and I think we'll move on. We have one more item.
Ask for public comment.
Okay. Is there any public
Sorry.
Any subcommittee updates?
There are no subcommittee updates from the current one.
Okay. And
So I'm sorry, is there an update, or did I miss it? I couldn't hear
There
you.
is
Oh, sorry,
There's
there's
not an update, okay.
anything else anybody has? Quick. Okay, motion to adjourn. I vote to adjourn, a second.
Second.
Anybody?
So just comment, there's nothing to discuss on the long-range calendar, is that, I saw that on the agenda, so is that, I'm not sure.
I think that's informational, but
Okay,
Yeah, we do plan to come to the commission to talk about our special taxes. So there's the two listed there, the parks
I
tax.
think we'll have an opportunity to rank up, to work on the agenda for the next meeting. And I actually, now that you bring it up, I've suggested that we have as a topic how to build a long-range calendar, so that we actually talk about what does staff see, what would staff items be, what would our items be, what would we like to talk about, what is council looking for, and I think doing an exercise of how we build that, so that we've got, not just what's going to happen in November, but really long range.
And Steve, I think, Mitchell, I thought you had something you wanted to request. You had sent an email to me and Elena about a topic you were hoping for the long range, and this would be an opportunity to do.
Yeah. So I had been discussing with other members of the community about the unfunded infrastructure projections, and was wondering about the funding thereof. So if that's something we might want to discuss, then it's definitely of interest to me, because probably something that has an easy, or at least a historical answer that I could educate myself.
Just for clarification, I assume when you say infrastructure, you're talking our transportation infrastructure?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anything else? Yeah, let's try this again. Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Anybody opposed?